Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our video series. Joining us once again is Andria Ryan with the law firm of Fisher Phillips. Fisher Phillips represents employers. On the labor and employment side, they have a national practice with offices in almost 50 states. Their website is absolutely remarkable and replete with resources for you. So if you don't do anything else, visit the FisherPhillips.com website. Andria focuses in the hospitality space as part of her practice, but she has a broad practice as well. So we hope you'll take advantage of her expertise. Speaking of that expertise, she's agreed to join us again today for one of these videos that we do from time to time. And this one is on hoteliers that need to know about President Biden's planned workplace vaccine mandates. They came out, I think, last week is when it was announced, and we're just now wrapping our arms around it. Andria, there's a lot going on. Let's get into the slide deck and kick it off. So the president started with a path out of the pandemic. He mentioned 6 prongs, but not all of them are around this mandate for 100+ employees. What applies to the hotels?
The hotels need to be thinking about the parts that apply to them, obviously. Number one, if you've got a federal contract, and obviously healthcare workers, that's a separate executive order. So if you've got a federal contract, if you haven't thought about that in a while, maybe time to take a look. You've got a vaccine mandate that is likely going to survive most challenges. The other portion of the path is a requirement that all employers with 100+ employees, and I promise we'll get to the issue of the 100+ employees, have a plan in place to ensure their employees are either fully vaccinated or tested weekly. And then the third prong that's going to apply to folks is requiring paid time off to get vaccinated or to take time off if they suffer some consequences, some side effects of the vaccination. So that's the general overview of this mandate as it's going to apply to hoteliers.
Okay, well, then on this next slide, though, we have, a lot of people are questioning, how is this going to work? What government agency that we show on this next slide, what government agency are we going to look to get this going?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. The Biden administration is planning on involving OSHA to issue a emergency temporary standard, an ETS. So most employers are covered by OSHA. Now, unless you're in the construction industry or something like that, you probably don't have day-to-day or monthly interactions with OSHA. But most employers, almost all employers, are covered either by OSHA or an equivalent state agency. And so OSHA has been tasked with developing an emergency temporary standard. We're, as you can see on the slide, we're estimating this will impact 80 million workers, 2/3 of the country's workforce. So they will issue an emergency temporary standard. Now, the last one they issued that was COVID related took them 4 months to prepare, and it dealt with healthcare employers only. The Biden administration said this is coming in a few weeks. So we presume there was some standards that are all, some regulations were already being discussed, that there's at least a framework. But the emergency temporary standard, if there is a grave danger to worker safety, then OSHA can issue this emergency worker standard, and it will stay in place for 6 months until a permanent standard has to be made. So that's what we're dealing with here. So if you hear that phrase ETS, that's how this mandate will be issued.
Okay, so ETS, emergency temporary standard, it's going to be pervasive. It's going to cover a lot of folks, and there are fines if you don't comply, up to $14,000
per violation. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to tell you a couple times today, we don't know exactly what that means. Is it $14,000 per employee that's not vaccinated? Is it $14,000 per inspection from OSHA when they find that you're not enforcing the mandate? We're not sure, but we know the emergency temporary standard will tell us that. $14,000 number ought to scare us no matter what.
All right, that's terrific. But in this next slide, we're suggesting that hotels shouldn't wait for the ETS to be issued. Is that right?
Well, it's right, Stephen, and it's really because the logistics of getting this up and running are burdensome. And so you need to start thinking about, whether you actually start the mandate or whether you just put the mechanisms in place to work with either the testing or the mandate. OSHA's certainly urging you to voluntarily do it. Whether you choose to do that or not, at least start thinking about what that looks like for your operation. At the end of this presentation, Stephen, we're going to talk about that, sort of the steps to start thinking about, the very practical steps I think you need to start thinking about.
Yeah. Okay. So that's good, because there's also a lot of unanswered questions, but you need to think about those now, as you just pointed out, to be prepared. So when it does come down, we're ready to go.
That's right. And we can look at other OSHA guidelines and regulations for some guidance on these unanswered questions, but truly we are, looking into a crystal ball for some of them. And we will, we are on wait. We're sitting on hold, waiting for that ETS to get issued. And I'm sure we'll digest it. We will pick it apart and make sure we understand what the obligations are. But
well, one of the key questions for everybody, not so much on the hotel side, because we don't have as many remote workers as some other types of businesses that you guys might represent, but we do have some, Andrea. So on this next slide, we ask the question, will remote employees be covered?
Well, yeah, agreed that this is a very small minority of your employees, if any. But OSHA did have, on the Friday after the announcement, President Biden's announcement, they had some talking sessions. And one thing they did say on Friday during these sessions, the emergency temporary standard will not apply to employees who never come to work, 100% remote. But if they work ever in the office, if they work with your customers or your clients, or they visit sites, then they're going to be covered. So unlikely that many of your employees will be affected here.
Well, but I'm trying to encourage hotels to use more remote work, for sales, for marketing people and things like that. But should they, you're right, I agree with you completely. It's a minority, but they need to know about this. So thank you. That's very helpful. And let's get to the thick of it right now, though, on this next slide, which is, how will the 100 employee threshold be counted?
Yeah, that is a big question, and it is probably the most common one we're being asked right now, because folks are saying, I have 4 hotels, I only have 30 employees or 40 employees at each hotel.
Right.
Could I possibly be covered? There are different EIN numbers, for example. I have different payrolls for them. Will it aggregate? So we need more clarity here, obviously. One thing we always want to look at as well is a joint employer analysis. Under the Trump administration, the rules had loosened significantly about joint employer. Under the Biden administration, they're tightening them up. So any contract employees, any temporary employees may be added in to your employee count. Congress, administrative agencies often don't contemplate every type of business, and so the hotel business sometimes doesn't get a lot of attention, and that unusual relationship where we have common ownership but different operations. We're going to have to, hopefully we'll do a good job of the lawyers in the world will do a good job of helping you guide through that. But I would urge you to be careful here. If you want to try to either integrate to be 100 or more, or try to stay away from being integrated, if you do that, it affects other things than just this OSHA temporary standard. So, we don't make rash decisions based upon just this particular standard that's going to come out from OSHA. It's a decision you may not want to live with in the long run if you decide to decentralize your operations.
That's a great point.
Stephen, we would suspect someone who has common ownership, common control of labor relations, common, sharing of employees between operations, that is likely going to be considered one employer for purposes of this ETS. More likely than not.
Yeah, I agree with you. That common ownership piece, and I think they learned a lot with the PPP, right? And we'll see just how much they learned and how comprehensive they want this to be. So on the hotel side, folks, as Andrea mentioned, be cautious, get some professional guidance, because this can impact you in a much deeper way than just whether or not you've got to comply with this mandate.
Significantly. Now, remember, also, it's going to be enforced by OSHA, which means their inspectors will come in, but your employees can also complain. So if you don't implement a mandate, then that they think should be implemented, you don't have to wait for an OSHA to figure out or randomly inspect you, which is unlikely. More likely than not, somebody's going to call and complain.
That's a very good point. So beware for sure.
Be careful.
So this next question on this next slide, Andrea, will employers be required to collect proof of vaccination status of our employees?
Unclear at this time, obviously, but likely. And now the question will become what method of collection, how much information are you going to get? We've already been facing this with employers that have been mandating vaccines.
Right.
They are already struggling with, do I keep a copy of the card? Do I keep a spreadsheet? But in any event, and I'll talk a little bit more specifics about what I think would be best practices. But if OSHA mandates that you collect this information and not use the honor system, which we suspect they're not going to accept, OSHA records are required to be kept for 30 years. So unlike other employment records, OSHA has the longest record keeping requirement of all the federal laws. And so we're talking about either testing results or vaccination results that you'll have to figure out how to maintain confidentially for 30 years.
Yep. And Andrea, can you just clarify something that I know a lot of people are thinking about? Oh my gosh, what about HIPAA? It won't let me do this. Can you clarify that for everybody?
I will. Let me tell you with certainty, HIPAA does not apply to this situation.
Right.
A lot of employees think it does, and a lot of our clients think it does as well, because it feels like you're dealing with sensitive information. But HIPAA does not prohibit you from getting information that proves your employees have been vaccinated and the dates they've been vaccinated, perhaps the vaccine, the type of vaccine they've had. HIPAA has gives you some obligations. If you're self-insured about distributing information or giving out health-related information, but it does not apply in these circumstances.
Yeah, we can collect this information. We need to keep it private, like we would any other personnel records. Is that fair?
That's fair.
That's there. Okay, so let's walk away with that.
Any confidential medical records, we keep those more confidential than personnel records.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, but again, that's not because of HIPAA.
That's correct. That's because of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
There you go. And everybody needs to understand that distinction, because a lot of people will throw up HIPAA and you're like, no. It's a very narrow swath of industry that it applies to. So it's important that we make that distinction. Okay, so we've got more unanswered questions on this next slide. For instance, what do we know what type of testing is going to be required? Because there's several options.
There are several options. There are several options at various cost levels. We're unclear at this time. Obviously, the PCR test is known to be the most accurate, but it's more expensive and takes more time to get test results. It goes to the lab. We are unsure whether OSHA will permit at-home testing, which of course have some flaws in there as well, because I could take a test and I could be negative, and I could give the results to my significant other or spouse and let them show those results to my employer. It's hard to maintain. Will they allow on-site testing? Will you do testing on your property? Will you have a third party come in and do those tests? Will you use the rapid tests, which are less reliable but quicker? Yeah, and at home tests. It sounds like maybe we've learned from drug testing, right? Securing the results. So it's going to be interesting. Lot to think about here for sure. But hopefully, most people will gravitate toward the vaccine. Well, that's really, as you can see, the underlying push here is to push people towards the vaccine. And we talk about some of the practical aspects here in a moment. And I'll say it's very clear that mandating the vaccine is going to be your easiest route. Very good. So we've got another question then on this next slide. Andrea, who's going to pay for the testing? Do we know yet? Unclear as well. We know insurance covers the cost of some tests, certainly the cost of vaccines. Several state laws, the ones the beautiful states like California that you expect, already have laws predating COVID that required employers to pay for mandatory medical tests. So we've got those state laws, and now we're likely going to have an OSHA ETS that's going to give us some guidance here as well. But if we're requiring it, we're likely paying for it. Well, and that leads us right into the next slide, which is the question of, do we have to pay our employees for the time they take to get tested? So let me make sure I'm clear about this. This whole thing is
is challenging, right? Because they're opting out of the vaccine. We might have to pay for the test, and we might have to pay compensatory time to go get the test if they would just get the vaccine. All right, I don't want to go there, but that's where my mind has taken me. So we don't know yet at this time, but you have some thoughts.
We do have some thoughts. I mean, the wage and hour laws are pretty strict. If we're requiring it, if it's a requirement of work, then you're likely going to be required to pay for the time. Now, OSHA has said in their comments that you need to provide paid time off or use existing PTO, but once they run out of that, what are you going to do? And I was on a webinar yesterday, and I commented, I said, folks are they'll be off duty. And if you don't have timekeeping systems in place right now where your off-duty housekeeper, who you're requiring to get a test on her day off before she returns to work on Friday, how are you going to keep track of that time? It's time to start thinking about that. If you're required to pay, do you have a system, or is there a system available to you that will allow your employees to keep accurate time records and turn them into you for purposes of payment?
Okay, a lot to think about there, folks. So yeah, stay tuned. Look, we understand that we can't give you total clarity. We're going to follow this up with another program, and we do get clarity, but we want to get you on a head start right now.
We do.
And so on this next slide, then, Andrea, the question has to come up. I'm in the hotel business. I've got a collective bargaining agreement, a unionized workforce. What's the impact going to be? Do we know yet?
We don't know. I mean, much of it depends on what your contract looks like, what your collective bargaining agreement looks like. So to the extent that you've got a broad management rights clause or a broad safety policy, perhaps you will not be compelled to bargain over the decision to comply with OSHA's emergency temporary standard, and maybe just have the obligation to bargain over the effects. But another point I want to make, and you see here on the slide, is even non-union employers really need to consider the practical implications of this from a labor relations perspective. If you're not complying, if you decide to fly under the radar and not comply, as I mentioned earlier, your employees may see that. As much as some of them resist being vaccinated or mandated to be vaccinated, they see that as you're not caring about their safety. And so oftentimes they turn to third parties. If they don't turn to the government, they sometimes turn to a third party like a union to help them solve those problems. So we don't want to get on the union's radar for being in violation of our vaccine mandate.
Yeah, we don't want to invite the union into the front door. The other piece that I think is worth mentioning, but I'll defer to you, is that if you try to fly under the radar and one of your employees does complain to OSHA, don't we need to keep in mind that retaliation for filing a complaint is really serious and severe penalties? Just want to remind everybody about that.
Retaliation against your employees for making a legitimate complaint to OSHA is a very serious case. And remember, now you've got the penalties, whether it's $14,000 per individual or $14,000 per event. You're now, if you get that penalty, the second one is you're a repeat offender. And under OSHA's normal rules, fines go up. We presume that's going to be the same here. If you're a repeat offender, your fines are higher.
Yeah, and let's also remind everybody that these types of fines are rarely, if ever, covered under insurance. So this is out-of-pocket money. So it's important that we pay attention and that we do our best to comply. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, Andrea, then, okay, so clearly, we say on this next slide, we ask the question, and I think it's rather rhetorical, will this temporary standard face legal challenges? I think states are already lining up, but what are you guys thinking?
They are starting to line up, but something to keep in mind is the many judges may say we can't challenge a standard that hasn't been issued yet. So we're going to wait and see what is issued. So it may have immediate effect. Lawsuits take a bit of time. It's got to make its way up to a circuit court, which takes obviously the legal maneuverings of the lower courts to get there. And then keep in mind, it's not certain that if a court were to overturn it, they didn't overturn the entire mandate. They may keep parts of it. They may overrule parts of it. They may put a temporary stay on it. A lot of legal mumbo jumbo that'll go on, but it won't happen in a day, and it won't happen in a week. Right. And so you've got to count on this standard coming into force at some level. And then if there's a legal challenge to it, you may unwind a few things. But a successful legal challenge, you may unwind a few things, but you can't count.
Well, yeah, this is, I think we need to count, as you point out in this last bullet, I think we need to be prepared. So let's talk about, we start in this next slide talking about what are the things we need to be thinking about. So I'm in a hotel. Now I've got 100, let's say I've got 100 plus. I figure that I'm there. What do I need to be doing?
Well, the first thing you need to do is determine what your employee's vaccination status is, your current workforce. EEOC has told us it's okay to ask. Now, we recommend you ask, have you been vaccinated, yes or no? Perhaps you request proof in anticipation of OSHA requiring proof as well. That is not an illegal medical question. It's not an illegal question under HIPAA. It's not an illegal question anywhere. You may ask it. Don't ask anything else. That should end your inquiry. Just simply yes or no, maybe the dates and the type of vaccine. We suspect, as I said, the ETS is going to require proof. So you may decide now to keep a copy of that card or maintain a spreadsheet. But if you do maintain a spreadsheet, let's have dates and times, dates of the vaccine, just in case a booster is required at some point.
Yeah.
But what's important is that your employees know that this will be kept confidential, meaning somebody, not their supervisor, but someone in whoever's in your HR role, whoever maintains personnel files, workers' comp documents, sick leave requests, things like that. That's the kind of level of confidentiality we're looking for. Now, people will say to me, well, how do we let their supervisors know? Currently, for example, with masks, if you're not vaccinated, you need to wear a mask. How do we let supervisors know if their employees are vaccinated? Well, we're not going to let them know. What we're going to let our leadership know is this is the list of employees that need to wear a mask, and this is a list of employees that don't need to wear a mask. Right? You can read between the lines, but I will say there are some people that are vaccinated that don't want to give you proof of their vaccination. They just don't think it's your business. Right. And so you need to treat them as an unvaccinated person until you have proof. So think about how you're going to make that request of your employees, when you're going to make it, and how you're going to keep that information.
Yeah, hopefully there won't be many exceptions like that, but it's a great point that you have, if they don't give you proof, you've got to treat them as unvaccinated. That's right. Very good. Well, so let's keep going and look at this next slide, because you've got other suggestions about things we could be doing now.
Well, we can. So the president's order said the employer will be required to mandate the vaccine or allow unvaccinated employees to be tested weekly. Now, what you need to think about is the pros and cons of both, right? If you mandate the vaccine, you may lose some staff. They may go somewhere where the hotelier is testing instead of requiring vaccine. Our very challenging staffing situation right now. Are you going to defer to just letting your employees be tested weekly? Or are you going to mandate the vaccine? Now, if you choose tested weekly, you got to the logistics of testing weekly are quite burdensome. If you look, are you going to do it on site? Are you going to do it through designated vendors? Who's going to collect the results? Who's going to keep track of when each employee's time has come for their next testing? Sally tests on Monday, and Bob needs to be tested on Tuesday, and Jack needs to be tested on Tuesday as well. When and how are you going to collect those results? How are you going to keep track of the results? So choosing the testing option, brings quite a logistical burden to you, which is, again, I think the administration's point here is that mandating vaccines is likely the easiest path for you, not without its troubles, but probably logistically the easier path.
Listen, that's very helpful.
What you today start thinking about what you think you can do in your organization and maintain.
Yeah, that's very helpful guidance, and I want to call everybody's attention to this second bullet. Right now, Andrea, according to the guidance from OSHA, we feel like as the innkeeper, I can require vaccinations, a true mandate, without providing the alternative for weekly testing. Just want to make that clear. Subject to the accommodations, yeah.
Correct. Well, we'll talk about accommodations in a moment. But you're right. This is not an employee's choice. This is your choice. Your choice.
That's an important, and that's why she's saying to you folks that you need to ask yourself now, am I going to mandate it, or am I going to say you need to get tested, you need to get the vaccine or get tested? But you don't have to do that second one.
That's correct.
But as Andrea just mentioned, there are potential consequences for that, and you need to think those through carefully. Andrea, that's very helpful. Okay, so on this next slide then, we're going to have situations where employees, as you mentioned, are not going to comply. Real quickly, what are we looking at there?
This is a safety rule. You need to put it out there as a safety rule, whatever method, mandate or vaccination and testing as an alternative. Whatever it is, it's a safety rule and it needs to be enforced. It will not be meaningful if it's not enforced. And so just start thinking about what that enforcement looks like. Do you do normal progressive discipline? Do you give them 2 or 3 warnings and then they get terminated? Do you terminate on the first? It's a serious safety violation. Are you going to terminate? Do you give an employee a sort of contemplative 2 or 3 day leave of absence? Are you sure you want to you sure you don't want to comply with the safety rule? I'll let you go home and think about it for 48 hours. Make up your mind. You're basically self-terminating at that point. But you are certainly within your rights to discipline and ultimately terminate an employee for not following this rule.
And you know, Andrea, it's challenging for hotels, as you mentioned, the labor market being what it is, to, you know, we've got some suggestions for you folks, but we realize it's hard and it's challenging, and you're going to have to make some difficult choices. So hang in there, and we'll get back to you with some more guidance as soon as we get it. But we've got this one more slide we want to talk about, because as Andrea mentioned, there are some accommodations that might enable people to be exempt from the vaccine mandate, should that be your course. Andrea, can you walk us through that right before we wrap up?
2 laws. The Title VII requires accommodations for religious, sincerely held religious beliefs, and the Americans with Disabilities requires accommodation for someone with a disability. And you should expect, if you mandate vaccines, that you will have a number of employees that will come forward and ask for an accommodation to be exempt from the vaccination. You need a process in place. Please go to our website. We'll show you that in the next slide. We have forms, we have sample policies, we have sample requests for reasonable accommodation. But you need to, communicate and administer a meaningful process where the employee requests the accommodation and you review the situation. Can they be accommodated? The administration likely is going to give us the accommodation, and that's going to be weekly testing. So the employee, things like the employee continues to wear a mask. If you get the exemption, you follow all safety protocols, you social distance as much as you can, and you are tested weekly or maybe more often, is the likely accommodation that you will give to someone who has a legitimate request for an exemption from the vaccine.
That's very helpful. Let's put this last slide up just so people can take a screenshot of it, because there is great information on the Fisher & Phillips website, as Andrea mentioned. So
yeah, we have a COVID landing. We have a COVID landing page. You'll see when you go, and
okay.
You'll find some really helpful, not just wordy documents, helpful forms, helpful policies.
Yeah, and you've got an entire hospitality vertical, I think, don't you?
We do.
You do, and so
and
you
a
go
COVID
to
team and a vaccination team.
There you go. So FisherPhillips.com, services and industries, hospitality, but go to the COVID. I think is what Andrea is suggesting to you, and you'll find all of the forms and checklists that she's talked about. And I mean, it's terrific value. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. Andrea, any final thoughts?
I think we'll be back. We're all keeping an eye on what this ETS looks like. It's probably going to be one of the most significant ones OSHA's issued in a very, very long time. And so start thinking in advance and be ready.
Andrea, once again, thank you very much. You and your entire team at Fisher Phillips for this terrific insight. As she mentioned, we'll be back as soon as we can with an update. Thank you, Andrea.